She had $43 in her coat pocket, a dead phone, and the kind of cold that doesn't just touch skin. It finds the spaces between your bones and settles there. Clara Voss stood on the steps of the Callaway building at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in January, not because she had chosen to, but because the cab she had called 20 minutes ago had cancelled. The next one showed 38 minutes away, and the wind coming off the Hudson had turned the street into something that didn't feel like New York anymore. It felt like a punishment. She had been on her feet for 16 hours. The double shift had started at 7 that morning, a standard rotation that became extraordinary the moment the night nurse called out sick, and Clara, as always, said yes. Yes, because she needed the hours. Yes, because the hospital still hadn't processed her overtime from the previous month. Yes, because she had learned, in 5 years of working the private medical wing of Hargrove Memorial, that the people who say yes are the people who get to keep their jobs. Her coat was thin. She knew it was thin when she bought it 2 winters ago. It had been on sale, and at the time 30% off had mattered more than wool lining. She regretted it now with a clarity that was almost funny. She had already tried 3 things before she sat down on those steps. She had walked 2 blocks east toward the subway entrance, only to find it gated as maintenance work. A handwritten sign said, "No estimated reopening." She had ducked into a diner on the corner and asked to use their phone, and the man behind the counter had looked at her the way people look at problems they don't want to adopt. She had stood under the awning of a closed pharmacy and tried to calculate whether she could make it 6 more blocks on foot without losing feeling in her fingers. She had decided she could not, so she sat. Not dramatically, not in despair. Clara Voss was not given to dramatics. She sat with the precise, exhausted logic of someone who has already tried the other options and is now waiting for a better one to appear. Her chin was down, her hands were pressed between her knees. She was thinking about the heating bill she needed to pay on Friday, and whether her body could realistically walk the remaining distance home if the temperature dropped another degree. She did not hear the door open. She did not hear the footsteps. What she heard, after a silence that felt longer than it was a voice. Low, unhurried, the kind of voice that does not raise itself because it has never needed to. "You've been out here for 11 minutes. Clara looked up. The man standing above her was not dressed for the cold either, which meant he had come from inside. He was wearing a dark jacket over a white shirt, no tie, sleeves not quite rolled down. He was younger than she expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected, but not this. Not someone who looked like he had been in the middle of something quiet when he noticed her through a window and came out without thinking. He wasn't looking at her with pity. That was the first thing she registered. He was looking at her the way people look at a problem they actually intend to solve. "I counted," he added, as if that required explanation. Clara stood up. Not quickly, her knees protested, but she stood because she had been raised to meet people at eye level when possible. "My cab cancelled," she said. "I'm waiting for another one. In 35 degrees. It wasn't a question. "In 35 degrees, she confirmed. He looked at her for one more moment, not long, not rude, just the look of someone processing something, and then he stepped back and held the door open. "Come inside," he said. "You can wait in the lobby." The lobby of the Callaway building was the kind of space that made you aware of your own coat. Clara stepped inside and felt the warmth hit her face like something she hadn't realized she'd been starving for. The floor was pale marble. The ceiling was high enough that sound softened before it reached the top. There was a desk to the right, staffed by a man in his 50s who looked up, registered his employer's presence, registered Clara's presence, and then looked back down at his screen with the professional discretion of someone very well paid to not have opinions. Ashford Callaway, she didn't know his name yet, not then, walked to a seating area near the far wall and gestured toward a chair, not commanding, just indicating. The difference was subtle, but Clara noticed it. She sat. He remained standing for a moment, then sat across from her with the unhurried ease of someone who had never needed to fill a silence with noise. "Thank you," Clara said. "I won't be long." "The cab estimate is 40 minutes at this hour," he said. "Traffic from the bridge." She glanced at him. "How do you know what my estimate is?" "I don't, but the bridge has been backed up since 9. Every cab coming from that direction is running late." He paused. "You work at Hargrove." It wasn't a question this time either. Clara looked down at her badge, still clipped to her scrubs beneath her open coat. She had forgotten it was there. "Nurse, she said. "Medical wing." He nodded once, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. Clara studied him in the way she studied patients, quickly, efficiently, with the goal of understanding rather than judging. He was lean, with the kind of posture that comes not from effort, but from years of being watched. His hands were still. His eyes moved slowly across the room, not restlessly, but the way a person moves their gaze when they are used to taking inventory. He didn't introduce himself. She found that strange, and then she found it interesting. "I'm Clara," she said. He looked at her. "Ashford. Not Ash. Not Ford." The full name clearly without apology. "Do you live here?" she asked. "My family owns the building." She absorbed that without expression. "That explains why you know the lobby temperature." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. "The thermostat is set to 68. You'll warm up in about 4 minutes. She almost laughed. She didn't, but it was close. The lobby was quiet. A clock somewhere marked the half hour. Outside, through the tall glass front, the wind moved in visible sheets. Clara watched it and thought about her heating bill again, and then she thought about the patient she'd left. Mr. Garrison, room 14, recovering from cardiac surgery, who always asked her to check the window twice before she left because he was afraid of drafts. She had checked it twice. She always did. "You look like you're still working," Ashford said. She turned. He was watching her with that same steady attention. "Occupational habit," she said. "I'm always half somewhere else." "Which half is here?" She considered the question. It was not the kind of question people usually asked. "The cold one," she said finally. "The half that can still feel her feet." This time he did smile. It was brief and private, the kind of smile a person produces when something catches them genuinely off guard, and they haven't yet decided whether to let it show. Before she could say anything else, the elevator at the far end of the lobby opened, and a man stepped out. He was older, late 50s, perhaps 60, with silver hair and the particular kind of posture that says, "I own every room I enter, even when that is not technically true." He was wearing a suit at nearly midnight, and he was not surprised to see Ashford in the lobby. He was very surprised to see Clara. "Ashford." His voice was smooth in the way that expensive things are smooth, all the rough edges removed. "Edmund," Ashford said. His voice had not changed at all. That, Clara thought, was interesting. Edmund Calloway looked at Clara. His gaze was the kind that measures and finds wanting in the same motion. "I wasn't aware you had company." "She was cold," Ashford said simply. "She's waiting for a cab." Edmund's expression did not change, which was itself a kind of change. "I see." He turned back to his nephew. "I need 20 minutes. The Hong Kong call." "I know about the call," Ashford said. "I'll be up." Edmund glanced at Clara once more, a glance that said this conversation is not finished in a language Clara had spent her career learning to read in waiting rooms and family consultations. Then he got back in the elevator. The doors closed. The lobby returned to its quiet. Clara looked at Ashford. He was looking at the elevator doors. "Your uncle," she guessed. "Yes. He doesn't approve of lobbies being used for human warmth." Ashford turned back to her. "He doesn't approve of most things," he said evenly. "Don't take it personally." But the way he said it told her clearly, he will. The cab came 32 minutes later. In those 32 minutes they talked. Not much, not the way people talk when they are trying to impress each other, but the way people talk when they are tired, and the room is warm and there is nowhere else to be. Clara told him about the double shift, about Mr. Garrison and his window, about the subway entrance that had been gated without warning. Ashford listened the way she imagined he did everything, completely without interrupting, with the occasional question that proved he had been paying attention. He did not tell her much about himself. She noticed that. She also noticed that he did not deflect her questions. He answered them, simply and directly, just without elaboration. He was not hiding. He was conserving. When the cab notification came through on his phone, he had called one, she realized, from his own account without mentioning it. He stood before she did. "Your car is outside," he said. She looked at him. "You called it. You mentioned your phone was dead." She stood. She wrapped her coat tighter, knowing already that it would not be enough. She looked at him for a moment, this quiet, precise man who had counted 11 minutes and held a door open and sat across from her without performing anything, and she said, "Thank you, Ashford." He nodded once. She left. She told herself, walking to the cab, that it was a small thing, a lobby, a warm room, a cab called by a stranger who happened to have a working phone and a building that kept its thermostat at 68 degrees. She told herself that twice. She would not have thought about him again, or not more than briefly, the way you think about small kindnesses before they dissolve into the rest of life, except that 4 days later, Dr. Margaret Hale called her into her office and closed the door. "I need to tell you something," Margaret said, "and I need you to hear it carefully." Clara sat. She had been in this office enough times to know the difference between good news delivered carefully and bad news delivered carefully. This was the second kind. "You've been requested," Margaret said, "by name. Private patient assignment, off-site, the Calloway family." Clara felt something move through her that she didn't immediately name. "Ashford Calloway," Margaret continued, "is officially registered as a private patient under our extended care program. His family has contracted with the hospital for in-home monitoring. They've asked for you specifically." "Why me?" Margaret looked at her steadily. "The request came from Mr. Calloway himself, the younger one." Clara thought about that lobby, the thermostat at 68. "You've been out here for 11 minutes. What's the medical situation?" she asked, because that was the right question, and Clara always asked the right question first. Margaret slid a file across the desk. "Officially, fatigue, elevated stress markers, blood pressure fluctuation. Nothing critical. But the family," she paused, choosing words, "the family has a history of using medical documentation for other purposes." Clara looked up from the file. "What kind of purposes?" "Competency purposes," Margaret said quietly. "Edmund Calloway has petitioned twice in the past 14 months to have his nephew's fitness to manage the family estate evaluated. Both times the petitions were dismissed. A third petition is apparently in preparation." She folded her hands. "The concern, from the hospital's legal team, is that our involvement could be used as supporting documentation in either direction." Clara set the file down. "So you're asking me," she said slowly, "to take an assignment that may become evidence in a legal proceeding. And you're telling me this before I accept." "I'm telling you this because you deserve to know what you're walking into," Margaret said. "You can say no. No record. No consequence." Clara thought about Edmund Calloway's face in the elevator, the smooth, expensive quality of his disapproval, the way he had looked at her like she was a variable he would need to account for. She thought about Ashford, who had not explained himself to his uncle, who had said she was cold as if that were the only fact that mattered. She thought about Mr. Garrison, and the window she always checked twice, and what it meant to be someone's nurse. Not just their medication schedule, not just their vitals, but the person who tells the truth in a room full of people with complicated reasons to avoid it. "When do I start?" she said. Margaret's expression was careful. "Monday." "Then I'll see you Monday," Clara said, and stood up. She took the file with her. The Calloway residence was on the 14th floor of a tower on Central Park West, and it looked like someone had hired an architect to design a space that said, "We have always had money," without ever saying it out loud. Clara arrived at 8 on Monday morning in her professional coat, the good one. The one she kept for family meetings and difficult conversations, with her medical bag and the file she had read 4 times. She was met at the door by a woman named Iris, who was the household manager, and who looked at Clara with an expression of quiet relief that Clara filed away as significant. Ashford was in the study. He looked up when she entered, and for a half-second, less than that, really, something crossed his face that was neither surprise nor performance. It was the look of someone who had been waiting, without admitting to themselves that they were waiting. "Ms. Voss," he said. "Mr. Calloway." She set her bag down. "I've reviewed your file. I'd like to do a baseline assessment before we establish a monitoring routine. Is that acceptable? He looked at her for a moment. You read the whole file. Twice, she said. Then twice more. He stood. Then you know why you're here. I know what the file says, she said carefully. I'd prefer to form my own assessment. He nodded slowly. It was the nod of someone who has been told things about themselves by other people for a very long time, and is genuinely unsure what it means to be asked. The assessment took an hour. His blood pressure was elevated, but not dangerously so. His sleep patterns were disrupted. He had lost 7 pounds in 2 months, which he attributed to a schedule that left little room for meals. Clara documented everything precisely, and she asked questions in the way she had been trained, not leading, not assuming, just opening doors and seeing what walked through. What walked through gradually was a picture of a man being very deliberately worn down. He was being called to meetings at hours designed to disrupt sleep. Documents requiring his signature were being sent in waves, sometimes 30 in a single day, to create the appearance of inability to manage. His calendar was being filled by Edmund's assistant, with social obligations that conflicted with his actual commitments. Then the conflicts were being recorded as evidence of disorganization. Clara didn't ask about any of this directly. She didn't need to. She watched the shadows under his eyes. She watched the way he held himself. Straight, controlled, not because he was comfortable, but because he had decided that was the only way to get through. She wrote her clinical notes. She wrote them accurately. On the third day, Edmund appeared. He walked into the study at 10 in the morning without knocking, a small dominance gesture that Clara noticed and documented mentally. He looked at Clara with the expression she had seen in the lobby, refined now, slightly more deliberate. "Miss Voss," he said, "Mr. Calloway." She didn't stand. She was in the middle of updating her notes, and she didn't stand. Edmund's gaze registered this. "I wonder if I might have a word with my nephew privately." "Of course," Clara said, and began to gather her things. "Actually," Ashford said, quietly, without looking up from the window, "Clara is part of my medical team. Anything you need to say can be said in front of her." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Edmund looked at his nephew's back. Then he looked at Clara. "How long have you been a nurse, Miss Voss?" 5 years, she said evenly. "And before that?" "School." "Your family, are they from New York?" Clara set her pen down. She looked at Edmund Calloway with the particular steadiness she had developed over 5 years of delivering difficult information to people who did not want to hear it. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "if you have questions about my clinical qualifications, I'd be happy to provide documentation through the hospital. If you have questions about my personal background, I'd gently suggest those aren't relevant to my role here." She paused. "Is there something I can help you with medically?" The silence this time was different. Ashford had turned from the window. He was looking at his uncle with an expression Clara couldn't entirely read, but she thought, she was almost certain, that it was the expression of someone who had never watched that particular speech be given before. Edmund left without answering her question. Ashford said nothing for a long moment. Then, "You didn't need to do that." "I know," Clara said, and picked up her pen. That night, she received a call from Dr. Margaret Hale. "Edmund Calloway has filed a formal complaint with the hospital," Margaret said. "He's claiming that you are acting outside your clinical scope and creating an adversarial relationship with the family." Clara sat down on her couch. She thought about this. "Is the hospital going to pull me from the assignment?" A pause. "That depends," Margaret said carefully, "on whether Ashford Calloway wants you there. And if he does, then we stand behind our staff," Margaret said. "But Clara, be careful. This man has legal resources that most of our patients don't." Clara thanked her. She hung up. She sat for a while in her apartment that was still too cold because the heating bill had been paid late this month, and she thought about Mr. Garrison and his window and what it meant to be the person who tells the truth. She had not, she realized, been doing this for Ashford Calloway. She had been doing it because it was right. That, she thought, was probably the most dangerous kind of reason. The third petition arrived on a Thursday. Clara was in the study reviewing Ashford's updated blood work results when Iris appeared in the doorway With an expression that said something had already happened that couldn't be undone, she handed Ashford an envelope. He looked at the return address, and something in his face went very still. He read it. He set it down on the desk. He looked out the window at Central Park, which was grey and frozen and completely uninterested in the Calloway family's internal legal proceedings. Clara did not ask. She waited. "The third petition," he said, "filed this morning." He paused. "They've included your clinical notes." She had expected this. "Which ones?" "The initial assessment. They're arguing that your documentation of my stress indicators constitutes independent medical confirmation of instability." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "May I see it?" He passed the document across the desk without comment. She read it carefully, the way she read everything, not for what it said, but for what it assumed. What it assumed was that her notes were the end of the story. They were not. She had been keeping a second set of notes, not hidden. She was not given to dramatic gestures, but separate. A clinical log of her own observations, time-stamped, cross-referenced with Ashford's schedule. The meeting times designed to disrupt sleep, the document floods, the manufactured calendar conflicts. She had been documenting not just his condition, but the pattern of conditions being imposed upon him. She had not told him about this. She had not told anyone. On Friday, she made a phone call to a colleague, a woman named Dr. Patricia Ose, who worked in occupational health, and who had testified in 3 previous legal proceedings involving medical evidence. Clara asked her a very specific question about the standards for clinical documentation in competency proceedings. Dr. Ose answered it. On Saturday morning, Clara sent a formal letter to the Calloway family's legal representative. She attached her full clinical log, both sets. She included a written analysis, methodical and sourced, identifying the pattern of deliberate stress imposition she had documented. She referenced specifically that Edmund Calloway had attempted to question her personal background rather than her clinical credentials during a professional session, and that this constituted an attempt to undermine her role as an independent medical professional. She copied Dr. Margaret Hale. She copied Dr. Patricia Ose. She did not copy Ashford. He found out on Sunday when his own legal team called him. He came to find her in the small office Iris had set up for her near the study. He stood in the doorway. She was writing. She looked up. "You sent documentation to the legal team," he said. "Yes." "Without telling me?" "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" "Because if I had told you," she said, "it would have become your decision to make, and it wasn't your decision. It was mine. I'm the clinical professional of record. The documentation is mine to submit." He was quiet. Outside, the wind moved against the windows. "The petition has been suspended," he said, "pending review of your submission." "I know," she said. "I received the same notice." "It may not be dismissed entirely." "It may not," she agreed, "but it will be reviewed by people who now have full context, not partial context. That's all I can give you." He looked at her with that steady, unreadable quality she had come to recognize as his version of something felt deeply. "Clara," he said. She waited. "Thank you," he said. It was such a simple thing. 2 words, plainly given without drama. But the way he said them, not as gratitude for a service, but as acknowledgement of something that had cost her something, made her chest do something she did not immediately have clinical terminology for. "You're welcome," she said. "Your blood pressure is still elevated. I'd like you to take a walk in the park this afternoon." The ghost of a smile. "Is that a clinical recommendation?" "It is," she said. "I'm documenting it." That evening, after she had finished her notes and was preparing to leave, she passed the study and stopped. The door was half open. Ashford was inside, standing at the window with his back to the room. He was on the phone. She could hear the low murmur of his voice, too quiet to make out words. But what she noticed was what he was doing with his other hand. He had picked up the thin, inexpensive coat she had left draped over the chair near the door, the one she had arrived in that first night, the one that was not warm enough. He was holding it, not looking at it, just holding it absently, the way a person holds something without realizing they've picked it up. Then he set it down carefully. He smoothed it once with his palm gently, as though it were something worth being careful with. He did not know she had seen. Clara walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. She stood very still while she waited. She did not tell herself it was the petition was formally dismissed 11 days later. The reviewing board found Edmund Callaway's evidence insufficient, citing the incomplete nature of the clinical record he had submitted and the contradictory pattern identified in the full documentation. Edmund retained his counsel. His counsel was very expensive and very quiet about it. Ashford's legal team sent Clara a formal letter of acknowledgement. It used words like invaluable and decisive contribution. She filed it in her professional records and thought no more about it. What she thought about in the days that followed was the work itself. She continued the assignment. The medical monitoring continued, genuinely this time, without the shadow of the petition pressing down on every vital sign. Ashford's blood pressure began to regulate. His sleep patterns, according to his own reporting, improved. He ate more regularly. He began cautiously to rebuild the schedule that had been deliberately fractured. Clara documented everything. She was thorough. She was precise. She was, in all the ways that could be measured, professional. In the unmeasurable ways, she was something else. They developed a rhythm. She arrived at 8. She reviewed the overnight data. She gave him her assessment. He listened, asked questions, and did not argue with the answers. In the late mornings, they sometimes talked. Not about the case, not about the petition, but about other things. About the city. About work, hers and his. About small specific things that accumulate into something with weight. She told him about the subway entrance that had still not reopened, 4 weeks later. He told her about the building's infrastructure, the hidden systems behind marble walls, the decisions his grandfather had made that were still bearing consequences. She told him about Mr. Garrison, who had been discharged and sent home to his family in Ohio, and had sent the nursing station a card with a hand-drawn window on the front. He listened to this as though it were the most important story she had told him. She supposed in some ways it was. One morning in late February, she arrived to find a coat folded over the chair in the small office. Dark wool, properly lined, the kind that doesn't apologize for the cold. No note, no explanation. Iris, when Clara asked, said only that it had been left there this morning. Clara stood looking at it for a moment. She picked it up. She checked the inside collar. No brand tag, which meant it had been made for someone specifically. She checked the pockets, which were empty, except for a small folded piece of paper that said, in handwriting she was beginning to recognize, "The thermostat in the lobby is set to 68. The one in your building probably isn't." She stood there in the small office for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she folded the paper once, put it in her medical bag, hung the coat on the hook by the door, and went to do her work. Edmund Callaway resigned from the family board of directors on a Wednesday in March. The official statement cited personal reasons. The unofficial version, according to the legal correspondence Clara was no longer privy to, involved a separate investigation into the deliberate manipulation of corporate documentation. A pattern that had been identified in part because the same methodology had appeared in the medical petition. Clara heard this from Margaret, who had heard it from the hospital's legal team. She was in the break room eating lunch when she heard it. She finished her sandwich. She thought about it. She thought about a man standing at a window holding a thin coat with one careful hand, smoothing it once as though it were something worth being careful with. She thought about what that meant, not the coat, not the gesture, but the fact of it, that he had stood there, believing himself unseen, and still treated something that belonged to her as though it had value. That was, she thought, the thing about character. It doesn't perform. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in the way a person treats the things they think nobody is watching. She had been watching. The assignment formally ended on a Friday in early April, when Ashford's clinical markers were stable across all measures and the extended care protocol was complete. Clara filed her final report. She updated the hospital records. She submitted the last of her documentation. She went to say goodbye. He was in the study. He stood when she came in, not formally, just as a person stands when someone they are glad to see enters a room. "All stable," she said. "I've filed the final report. Dr. Hale will have it by end of day." I know, he said. She called me. A pause. Clara, he said. She waited. The building has a medical consulting role, he said. For staff. Residents, nothing dramatic. Quarterly assessments, emergency access. He paused. I asked the board to create a contracted position for an independent clinical advisor, someone without any connection to the family's financial interests. Another pause. Someone the board cannot intimidate. She looked at him. I thought you might know someone qualified, he said. She was quiet for a moment. I might, she said. I'd need to review the terms. Of course, Matt, he said. There was that ghost of a smile. The hours would need to be clearly defined, she said. Scope of responsibility in writing. Independent reporting structure. Naturally. And the thermostat in the office, she said, would need to be set above 68. He looked at her. The ghost became something more than a ghost. Done, he said. She nodded once. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. At the door, she stopped. She turned back. Ashford, she said. He looked at her across the room, steadily, completely, in that way he had that made it feel like the only thing he was doing was seeing her. You counted 11 minutes, she said. I did, he said. She held that for a moment. I would have been fine, she said. I know, he said. I counted anyway. She left. She took the elevator down to the lobby, which was warm and marble and set precisely at 68 degrees, and she walked out into April, which had finally reluctantly decided to stop being cold. She was wearing the wool coat. End.